Welcome to the debate. Here is a challenge, a frustration that every single one of us has felt. We know the solution to a problem. We have that moment of perfect intellectual clarity, that deep, reasoned insight into why we fail. Whether it's managing stress or breaking a habit or just sticking to a plan. And yet, when the moment actually arrives, we do the exact opposite of what we intended. We fail to apply the very knowledge we worked so hard to get.
And that disconnect is, you're right, it's incredibly frustrating. You could argue it's the most fundamental split in the human experience. Our source material frames this, I think, perfectly in terms of the brain's architecture. You have the powerful, fast, implicit system one. That's your gut reaction, your automatic habit. And then you have the slow, the effortful, explicit system two, the deliberate planner, the voice of reason.
So the essential question we are really trying to dissect today is this. When we're seeking fundamental self-change, is that conscious, intellectual insight, our deliberate system two reasoning, is that the effective, critical driver for lasting change?
Or is behavioral change just fundamentally dictated by those deeply wired, non-conscious procedural systems? The powerful inertia of System 1. Does that mean our insight is just the tip of an iceberg we can't actually steer? Because I maintain that the deepest levers of change are, in fact, non-conscious.
And I am going to argue that while insight on its own is, I agree, insufficient, it is the structured, conscious direction, the strategic application of reason that is the indispensable architect we need to dismantle the old and build the new. So to start, we have to acknowledge the pervasive failure of just good intentions, right? Simply wishing to exercise more. That's what's called a goal intention. And studies show this accounts for, a tiny percentage of successful behavioral change. It's just too abstract.
Exactly. It's an abstract wish.
But if you're basing your argument on the failure of that wish, I'd say the power isn't in the passive goal. It's in the active, conscious creation of a framework for action. The true genius of the conscious mind of System 2 lies in its ability to generate specific plans that bridge that gap between intention and action. I'm referring to implementation intentions, the concrete, if-then plans. This is where System 2 really takes charge. You consciously link a future critical situation, that's the if, with the precise goal-directed behavior, that's the then. And this is more than just a passing thought, it's an act of engineering. It's like writing code for your own behavior. You consciously program a trigger. For instance, if I open the refrigerator door, then I will only grab the water bottle. What this strategy does is it converts an abstract goal into something we call strategic automaticity. All the conscious effort is applied in advance so that when the trigger cue, the fridge door, appears, it completely bypasses the mental cost of deliberation. It makes the desired response immediate, efficient. And that framework, designed by System 2, is one of the most effective ways we found to overcome the tyranny of impulsive System 1 behaviors.
I find that fascinating. I really do. But let's be very precise about what's actually succeeding there. Implementation intentions work because they take an abstract goal, which is explicit, it's verbal, it's tied to your declarative memory, the memory for facts, the knowledge that there's water in the fridge. And they force it into an automatic procedural association, which is precisely the mechanism of System 1.
But it's consciously directed.
It is, but you're using a tool that fixes an implicit problem by leveraging implicit mechanics. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that intellectual insight, that semantic knowledge of why I shouldn't do this is functionally connected to the deep procedural systems that govern our automatic habits. Behavioral patterns are established through repetition. They become, ingrained circuits of the brain. These are often non-symbolic pathways, what some call the unthought known, that you just can't easily access with language. If you have a phobia, for example, no amount of intellectual understanding about how harmless a spider is will stop the alarm bell of the emotional brain from ringing. That memory is in the amygdala. It's separate from the factual cortex, and that automatic driver is always going to be faster and more powerful than your late-coming intellectual insight. And let's move past planning for a second and look at the actual moment of decision, especially when the stakes are personal. The idea that pure logic governs our choices is Well, it's fundamentally challenged by the somatic marker hypothesis. This theory argues that our complex decisions rely heavily on marker signals. These are physiological changes, the subtle feelings that arise from the body's bioregulatory processes. Your gut feeling.
Right.
And crucially, these markers don't always operate overtly, as a conscious feeling. More often, they operate covertly, non-consciously biasing our thinking before System 2 even gets the memo. Think about the clinical evidence. You have patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC, which is the key region connecting factual knowledge with our body's emotional feedback. Now, intellectually, these patients are perfectly intact. Their knowledge of logic, of social rules is perfect, and yet their decision-making in real life is catastrophic.
Yes, in those specific cases.
In lab settings, like the famous gambling task, they fail miserably. They keep choosing from the risky decks of cards. And why? Because they fail to generate those anticipatory somatic responses. You can measure this with skin conductance, that subtle arousal that signals an internal alarm to a risky option. That physiological warning system that should give them a bad feeling is broken. Without that powerful, non-conscious visceral bias, System 2 reasoning is, well, it's effectively rudderless. It leads to decisions that are logically sound in a vacuum, but disastrous in reality.
Okay, that's a powerful analysis of a broken system, I'll grant you that. But I would frame the implication completely differently. While that automatic bias clearly exists, and we know those somatic markers evolve to guide us quickly, the whole point of conscious change, the critical function of System 2, is to step in and either override or inhibit faulty processing. For the vast majority of us without VMPFC damage, the conscious system has the capacity to monitor those signals.
But does it have the power to overrule them?
I believe so. The VMPFC damage example just shows what happens when the connection is severed. It doesn't prove that in a healthy brain, System 2 is powerless. The whole utility of the cortex, the hardware for planning and logic, is defined by its ability to perform slow, rule-based reasoning, specifically to counteract things like the belief bias effect, where our rapid System 1 conclusions get in the way of logic. Our ability to process new evidence, to guide our beliefs even when it feels uncomfortable, that is the definition of intellectual freedom, and that is a System 2 function. In fact, when we successfully resolve a conflict, choosing the logical but difficult option over the easy one, it's the prefrontal cortex that lights up. This conflict resolution is effortful. It requires System 2 to hold the line against the faster System 1 response. Holding the line, that effortful inducement, however, is precisely what gets compromised when we are under genuine pressure. Let's introduce a powerful, universal counterexample: stress. Stress doesn't just put you in a bad mood, it actively changes the neural architecture of your brain.
It reduces capacity, of course. It does more than that.
Research shows that high cortisol periods from stress functionally shift the brain away from the goal-directed system, your prefrontal cortex, your System 2 hardware, and toward the stimulus response or habit system in the striatum. Stress forces a hardware change. It prioritizes fast survival over slow planning. You can see this in learning tasks. Stressed subjects are trained to perform an action for a reward. Then you devalue the reward, make the food pellet taste bad. The stress group just keeps performing the action for the now worthless reward. Their behavior is rigid, habitual, totally detached from the outcome's current value. And significantly, the stress also impaired their explicit, conscious knowledge of the action-outcome links. The moment of stress caused a measurable collapse of both mindful performance and intellectual awareness. It's a total victory for the non-conscious habit loop.
But if stress compromises the prefrontal cortex, the logical conclusion isn't to abandon consciousness, it's to apply it proactively. That only highlights the importance of using System 2 to create strategies outside of the crisis moments. This is exactly where implementation intentions become a necessary firewall. When we program that if-then structure, we are creating a mechanism of what's called goal shielding. We're taking the burden of complex deliberation off a compromised System 2. The conscious act of planning is designed to operate efficiently precisely when cognitive capacity is low, when you're tired, when you're stressed. The if-then rule automatically kicks in, protecting your long-term goal from that collapse into old habits. We use consciousness to build systems that function when consciousness itself fails.
I think ultimately this debate hinges on whether behavioral change is just an implicit accommodation to new experience or if it's a function of conscious transformation. I maintain that real change is achieved through reflective transformation. Habits, even deeply entrenched ones, can be weakened, and this happens through the conscious, sustained reinforcement of a new effort. And insight is critical here because it gives you awareness of why the old habit formed, which lets you target your volitional effort toward building new, better models. New neural networks aren't just stumbled upon, they are built through the dedicated commitment of System 2.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you describe the outcome, the new networks, but you misidentify the mechanism. You say insight is necessary, but the success of your primary tool, implementation intentions, proves my point. We have to take a rule-based shortcut to bypass deliberation. You acknowledge that if-then plans work because they are translated into an automatic association. So it's the implicit procedural mechanism that's the functional driver of change, not the initial explicit insight. And what about the limitations of explicit processing? The deep, foundational lessons we learn through early or traumatic experiences, fear responses, attachment patterns. That's all procedural. It isn't symbolic like language. Those memories are stored as pure procedure, as nonverbal blueprints. Research shows that just talking about the problem is relatively ineffective at altering this deep procedural knowledge. True transformation requires new procedural experiences that override the old implicit model, not just a better intellectual map of it.
So we absolutely agree that the aha moment of intellectual awareness does not guarantee action, but we diverge on the functional role of our higher faculties. I see conscious planning, strategic effort, and reflection as the indispensable catalyst, the architect required to design and reinforce those new, efficient automatic systems that we both agree are necessary for sustained change.
And I see System 2 as, frankly, often being outmaneuvered or just disabled by older, faster, and far more robust non-conscious systems that were built for survival. True, lasting shifts often require bypassing the very consciousness that's trying to change things and relying instead on the repetitive, associative learning of System 1 to establish new, safer procedural realities.
Really reveals a profound complexity to the self. A self that desires change is, at the same time, ruled by this fast, automatic circuitry, and also a slow, rational system capable of foresight and design.
Exactly. The battle for self-change isn't an intellectual argument you win with logic. It's a subtle war of attrition and redirection against the non-conscious forces that truly govern our daily actions. And maybe the true insight here is this. You might know exactly why you do what you do, but how much influence do your reasoned beliefs truly have when your brain is so powerfully wired for immediate habit and emotional survival?